The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on licensing electronic resources for Consortia. This is the last in a series of webinars in the Licensing Electronic Resources series. I am Amanda Stone, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Amy Pawlowski, the Deputy Director of Ohiolink, who manages Ohiolink's operations and e-resource negotiations. Amy came to Ohiolink from the Cleveland Public Library, where she was the web manager and oversaw e-resources. Amy brings much expertise to today's topic, especially in relation to Consortia, and we are fortunate to have her with us today. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now here's Amy. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Amy Pulaski. Thank you for joining me. A little bit about myself before we get started. I have been at Ohiolink for about 5 years and have been doing electronic resource contracting and negotiating the entire time there. As Amanda mentioned, I was at Cleveland Public and did some licensing of content for the public libraries and a public library consortia up in that area as well. So it's been an interesting road coming from public library negotiations to academic library negotiations, but it's been fun and I've been enjoying it. Also, Amanda mentioned that I do operations here. So aside from licensing, I also manage how things are moving through the organization and how they are processed. So what you'll probably notice today is me focusing on our processes a lot and where things are going. So today's presentation, today I'm going to talk to you briefly about library consortia. We'll take a little poll to see who's on the call today and how they're represented in our group. I'll talk a little bit about Ohiolink. I'll talk about how we at Ohiolink approach acquiring, renewing, and canceling content. Then I'll jump into our content negotiation process and approach. From there, I'll talk about our contract negotiation process and approach, which we run after we negotiate for the content, and I'll talk about that. And then I'll dive into how we communicate what we're doing with our members and how things work. And then I have a few other questions that I would like to do via a poll and potentially have a little bit of a discussion there. And of course, some time at the end for some questions and answers. Okay, so a Reader's Digest, a super condensed Reader's Digest version about library consortia. There are about 200 active library consortia worldwide. And I have a quote here from a great article written by Celeste Feather at EResources, in which she talks about the organization, the International Coalition of Library Consortia, which is a consortia of consortia. It talks about the origins of that and how that group moved forward. And in that, Celeste talks about how they represent different countries, and they're sometimes affiliated with their governments. But in the U.S., most often they're organized at the state or regional level or by a specific type of library. I also have another reference point for you to look at when considering how consortia work and their priorities, and that is the OCLT U.S. Library Consortia, and it's a snapshot of priorities and perspectives. This is from 2013, but I did find that the information that they had in there is still relevant today. So for example, Most library consortia have been in existence for more than 30 years. Most have more than 40 members, which is quite large. And then there's some breakdowns there. There's 52% are multi-type, so there are consortia of, publics and academics, potentially special. 24% are academic only, and then 16% are public only. For the most part, the focus on many U.S. consortia is facilitating resource sharing, increasing efficiencies through collaboration, and leadership through collaboration. Funding. So consortia receive funding from a variety of sources. Most frequently, it's public taxes, state funding, and membership fees. So when you think about the services that are most used through consortia, they are resource sharing, shared online catalog, and cooperative purchasing. So that's what we're going to talk about today, what happens with that last piece and what goes through that. And then finally, to wrap this up, licensing of e-content is really the top initiative among U.S. library consortia, both now and in the near future. And then that OCLC study does mention that funding is by far the most pressing challenge U.S. library consortia are facing today, most likely because we all are at this point. Okay, so I wanted to do a quick poll to kind of get the temperature of the room to see what types of consortia are represented today. So we have a poll up here, and if you could select the option that best fits your current work environment. So do you work at a consortia, or do you work at a library that is a member of just one consortium? Do you work at a library that might be a member of two consortia? Or do you work at a library that is not a member of a consortium? So I'll give you a couple minutes to select an appropriate answer. Okay, let's see where we are. So this is super interesting to me as well. And it's when I go to ICOLC meetings and I'm talking to different people that work at a consortia, we always talk about, well, there's always members that are participating in more than one, and that seems to be the case here with the majority of responses. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's go back to the presentation. And let's talk about Ohiolink. Oops. There we go. Okay, Ohiolink, so talking about that percentages, we sit in that about 24% of consortia in which we are academic only. We are state funded and technically an executive agency under the Ohio Department of Higher Education. So we do report up to that department and the chancellor. However, we do all sorts of billing and invoicing and a slew of other things. So we do have the Ohio State University functioning as our fiscal agent. So when you hear me walk through some of our processes with how we get things done, you will hear me referencing the Ohio State University. And again, that is because they're functioning as our fiscal agent. So the state of Ohio does provide our operating funds, and we receive capital dollars to put towards the purchase of e-journals. That means we are technically purchasing electronic journal content and locally hosting it here through what we call our EJC, or Electronic Journal Center. And again, you'll hear me referencing terms within our contracts that I need to put in there to address the ownership of that content. Normally with capital dollars, for those of you that are familiar with agencies, you put in capital dollars for building improvements or things you can touch. And because we actually do own that electronic journal content, we are able to pull up those operating funds for our purchases. So, and something else about Ohiolink, although there are some state funding put towards the group of resources. Most of the funding for our resources is provided by participating institutions. So we at Ohiolink don't get all of the money to purchase all of the things that we purchase as a group. We have some state dollars, as I mentioned, some operating, mostly capital going towards these purchases, and then our members will chip in for the rest of the costs once we work through a cost allocation model to ensure that we keep these good deals together and moving forward. So who are our members? We have 118 member libraries, and that means that we have 90 institutions. We say 118 members because most of you know in an academic setting, you are breaking out law schools and medical school libraries at an institution. They have different funding lines. So we count those as separate members. So if you run down the line of the 90 institutions, we have 16 public institutions, 49 private institutions, 23 community colleges, 16 regional campus libraries, 8 law schools, 5 medical schools, and then the State Library of Ohio and the Cleveland Clinic as well. So when I talk about our members, I want to mention that when we're going through and negotiating, we have a large spectrum of institutions. So we have The Ohio State University, through Oberlin, through Bowling Green State University, Cuyahoga County Community College, Stark State, down to the Athenaeum of Ohio. So we have very large institutions through very small institutions. With a few exceptions, you can reliably say that all nonprofit institutions of higher education are members of Ohiolink. So there's just a few very small nonprofits in the state that are not members. Our services. So Ohiolink was founded under the auspice of sharing print materials, and back in the 90s, that's how it all began. Some institutions had put in for some funding to try to build new buildings, and the legislature said, no, you should really share your materials, figure out how to do that, and thus Ohiolink was born. So with that, right now, with our shared print collections, we have over 45 million items, which means every year we're delivering out to institutions 350,000 items. As we moved through the 90s into the 2000s, it became clear that Ohiolink could benefit from doing some early e-resource journal acquisitions with vendors. So that is another cornerstone of what we do. With our shared e-resources, we have an annual content purchase of about $44 million. Right now, our collection is at over 29 million electronic journal articles and over 11,000 journals. We also negotiate and sign contracts for research databases and e-book packages. As I mentioned a little earlier, Ohiolink isn't just a group that gets together and tries to share resources and electronic content for our members. We also provide technology services. So when I say e-journal, e-book, and database platforms, we, as I mentioned, locally load our e-journal content into our EJC platform and serve that up to our members as a discovery tool. We also have an electronic book center that we call the EBC, and the same goes for that. Any ebook contract in which we're purchasing that content gets served, gets loaded onto that platform and served up to our members, and then database platforms. We also have, and this is open to the public, the Electronic Theses and Dissertation Center, the ETD as we lovingly call it, in which institutions can choose to participate to upload their theses and dissertations from students working at their institution. We do have a central catalog to share all of our print materials, and I think this is probably unique in that all of our member libraries are on Innovative. So when we're running that central catalog, it's in reach. But again, we're not running any DCB boxes. Everybody is connected through their local Innovative installation. We also have a group contract for EDS, a discovery layer, and a link resolver. We also, this started about 4 or 5 years ago, started cataloging any material that Ohiolink negotiated and purchased from the center here. So we have 2 catalogers on staff that catalog our records and send them out to members to load into their catalog and make any edits or changes locally as they like, and that has been very popular amongst our members. Most recently, Ohiolink has stepped into what we are calling the affordable learning arena, and this is our efforts towards open education resources, helping move those forward within the organization. And then most recently, we negotiated inclusive access textbook deals with the 5 big textbook publishers, which has been an interesting venture and something I'm not really going to touch upon much today. Lastly, we offer a group e-tutoring. So we have an e-tutoring manager, and we have institutions that choose to participate in this group e-tutoring. So we've, from the center, we're working with the administrator of the e-tutoring program as well as the platform. So we have a pretty big plate. Okay, so how does Ohiolink approach acquiring and canceling content? We have a committee that we call CIRM, lovingly, which is the Cooperative Information Resource Management Committee. Most times to vendors, I just refer to them as the Resource Committee because that seems to describe exactly what they do. And this group explores and makes recommendations to the Library Advisory Council, which we call LAC, on content. LAC is our group of directors that drive decision-making for the organization or help guide how we approach projects with the Department of Higher Ed. The group focuses on cooperative resource management issues and recommends new policies and procedures, aside from talking about should we renew, should we not renew specific content. The people that are sitting on my CIRM committee are collection development librarians and acquisition librarians. We, in many instances at institutions, those are ADs. So it's not, it's a nice mix of collection development librarian positions within our libraries. This group meets in person once a month, and I think it is without saying that that is probably why we are as successful as we are with what we do. That's an important feature of this group. So how are they making decisions? Up here, I have the link down at the bottom of the page as well if you want to reference this. Ohiolink, the CIRM committee came up with what we are calling our collection development principles. And these are the broad principles that guide the selection of the electronic content that we share among all Ohiolink members. So just going through this, that content meets statewide strategic and sustainable priorities for education and research. So this is really just ensuring that content fits the needs and the curricula across the state of Ohio. The second one, decisions about and support for content are made by member organizations. So this again goes back to, the members are putting in their portion to make these deals go, since there isn't enough state funding to make it go just at the state level. So they really get to decide how their money is being used and the content is being selected. Number 3, there is a high need across the majority of membership for basic resources. So like I said, we have a wide spectrum of members, and we need to ensure that the majority of the members gain value from any group purchases that we decide to move forward with. Number 5, there is a firm commitment of sufficient funds for the members, so basic resources, or the research-intensive members, the research resources. So this is really kind of Ohiolink being pragmatic. When we're looking at things, we want to make sure that resource acquisition, discovery, and negotiation takes place takes time and resources both at the Ohiolink Center and our members that are looking at procuring these resources. And we really don't want to waste any time on projects that won't go. So when we're looking at content, we need to make sure there's at least a firm commitment that this is something that will be picked up once we get to reasonable pricing. Number 5 is price savings are substantially better than individual institutional purchases or subscriptions, and this is just common sense. Really, no one should pay more or close to street price for a deal through Ohiolink. You know, the return on investment just isn't there to make members pay more than they would on their own. So that's a big one. And then lastly, management of the content supports efficiencies for staffing at Ohiolink and member institutions. So that just means that a deal can't be too onerous. For example, Ohiolink hasn't really stepped into a big DDA package simply because we ran a pilot, gosh, it was right when I started about 5 years ago, and the time and commitment that it took Ohiolink employees at the center to make sure that everything was moving along as it should was a little onerous. And then once we took a look at what we had collected after that pilot project, we didn't see a very big ROI, so we really haven't stepped into another DDA project since. Okay, so how is our content offered? CIRMA Resource Committee designates each Ohiolink resource as core, NPR, or opt-in. So core resources are resources that all members have access to, and again, they contribute on the resource costs. So with Ohiolink, the majority of our deals, we call them all-in deals. All of our members get access, and all are paying some money towards the deal. We also run a model called the NPR model, which is exactly what you think it is. So I negotiate a deal with a vendor. I come back to the membership and I say, okay, this is how much this resource will cost. And everyone starts sending me pledge amounts. Now, this doesn't just happen willy-nilly. We usually only offer NPR resources if they've already been offered before in the past. So we haven't really picked up any new NPR resources recently. And what I'll do is when I send out a call for pledges, we try to give the group as much data as we can about those resources. So do we know what list price is? And what did you pledge last year, and what's your pledge amount from last year plus the negotiated increase? So they know that if they're getting close to street price, perhaps they shouldn't pledge as much as they would have had they not known that information. So that's always a fun process to work through. We don't do very many NPRs. I think we have at this point 3 or 4. And then we do opt-in resources, which I think is probably most common. So we will let the membership know what resources we're going to offer as opt-ins. We do kind of like an open enrollment process in which I say, okay, these are the resources we're going to offer for opt-ins. Please fill out this survey and let me know if you're interested in pricing. At that point, I gather interest, I go off to the vendor, I negotiate pricing, and when I come back to the membership, I present the prices as negotiated, and then they let me know if they want to participate or not. As far as terms are concerned, we do both 1-year and multi-year contracts. I know that's probably going to be a question. And we've done up to 4 years. We haven't gone up over 4 years on contract terms. Okay, so what is our negotiation process? So the first step is Ohiolink Central, the Ohiolink offices does data gathering and then analysis. And then really that analysis depends on the type of acquisition. So as you can see here for renewals, we'll take a look at the pricing history, notating any package variances. And what I mean by that is I want to know what the increases were for my package year over year. And sometimes when we're picking up transfer titles from one publisher to another, that may skew that percentage. So I make sure I know what the negotiated increase was and then what the actual increase was based on any added or reduced content. We look at cost per use. We work with the vendor to look at denials to see if there's anything we might want to add to a journal package. The use per institution. We also take a look by journal over the past 5 years. And then for ebooks, we look by use by title and by package over the last 5 years. We also take a close look at what our members are subscribing to locally. So in the case of trying to define, quote unquote, the big deal, Ohiolink's deals technically are big deals, but they're not everything a publisher has. We have one in which that is the case, but most of our packages we consider custom packages because we are not picking everything up from that publisher. So what we'll do is we'll take a look with CERM and send out a survey to see if there's any local subscriptions to journals that are sitting outside of our package to see if we should potentially roll them into the Ohiolink package for some savings. And then we take a look at the outcome and consequences of previously canceled packages. And this is a big deal. And I think this speaks to really how we're moving forward with our decision making. So we've canceled 2 packages in the past 4 years, and we've been keeping track of those because the outcome was really not good for anybody. The publisher was getting less money out of the state. Our members were getting less content, and then we had a few members that were actually paying a little bit more for less content. So we take that very seriously, and we look at those things and try to anticipate any of that should we be looking at a deal that's slightly contentious. For potential new resources, we will look at local subscriptions to see if anybody is picking this up locally and gather that information and gauge is it the majority of our institutions or not. We'll send out a survey asking members for local subscriptions, and I have E and P here because we do this when we're looking at picking up a potential new ebook package, which is a big deal. We talk about how much are you spending on ebooks locally, and then how much are you spending on print books, and specifically print books from a particular publisher, because as we all know, there's not a lot of new money out there. So being able to use those print dollars for several books and moving that into a big ebook package is very advantageous for our members. And then we may take a look at our central catalog and try to pull some of that information out as well to see if we can match things up. From there, we present our findings at the CERM meeting for a strategy discussion. And at that point, this is where CERM really does the majority of the work. We are talking about, we're looking at all the usage. Does that make sense? Should we be removing content or adding content? We really take a microscope to all of the data analysis that we had done and try to define a path forward and how we want to proceed. From there, Ohiolink, so the central offices, which is me, starts negotiating with the vendor. And then there's a back and forth until I get something in which I know that the resource committee will be happy. And this is why that prior step is so important. We have those discussions about what exactly we could do and couldn't do. So I have a lot of information stepping into that negotiation process in which I can easily move in and out of options offered by the vendors. As we all know, they're always going to try to sell us more than what we're asking. Once I get the package into something I'm happy with and that our executive director is happy with, then we present it to our resource committee and LAC, which is the director's committee. And then they vote yes or no on the renewal or pickup of that resource. Okay, for central offices vendor-publisher negotiation approach. Ohiolink uses that initial data gathering and analysis when meeting with the vendors. And I wanted to touch upon this because I think there's some good takeaways for all of you. It is important to know your organization's pricing history and any edits or changes to deals over time. I have had vendors come in and misrepresent Ohiolink increases in the past. I don't think it was intentional, But if you have a new vendor contact, they might not know the history of the package. So I make sure that I know exactly what is going on. So if there is a discrepancy with what they are saying and what I know to be the truth, we can talk that through. We also take a very close look at the usage reports. Vendors will provide you their own version of the usage reports, which for the most part is correct information, but sometimes there may be an instance where they'll spin it one way or another, so something to look out for. You may get a report from a vendor that didn't understand how the data or the usage is constructed. So they may be giving you usage for content that is open to users, such as a table of contents on a book, and say that there was a use on one of your items, but in reality, that was one of your users just looking at a table of contents for a title that you didn't actually own. So we take a very close look at our usage reports. I have a collection analyst on staff who is amazing, and we go through that to make sure that we know exactly how that content is being used or not used. If there is a contentious renewal, we always know what will happen to each of the members if the deal is not renewed. So we talk, again, at our resource committee, we talk very closely about what would happen should this fall apart. And that kind of gives us a direction with how far we need to go in our negotiations and what paths we can go down. We also try to anticipate pressure points. So we have this, we do an informal market analysis and then have a discussion with CERM. And what I mean by that is, perhaps you could call it a vendor gossip session, but I want to know from my members what vendors are calling you, what content packages are they trying to pitch to you, you know, it's trying to get an idea of what, quite honestly, their bonuses are wrapped around at a particular vendor. So we can help negotiate the waters and get to the best deal as possible. And as I mentioned, with CERM, we outline an acceptable outcome before talking to vendors. And what that means is I know if they're willing to cancel, if they're willing to not cancel, if they're willing to cut the package in half or not cut the package in half, if they're willing to pick up ebooks, if the pricing comes down for journals. I know all of those things before I walk into a negotiation. With that, I'd like to say we take a pragmatic approach into how we deal with all of our packages. There are also usually a series of meetings, in-person calls or emails with the vendor as I'm going through the negotiation process. And I will, from time to time, need to ask CERM their advice or questions to make sure I'm getting to the right answers through the process. And CERM will do that through a listserv, and they're very active. Everyone on that group responds very timely and with good information as we're going through a negotiation process. Okay. So contracts. When we take the time to build a relationship with our legal department, or I have in the past 5 years, and I think that speaks to the current process for how we get through contracts and how well it does work for us at this point. So with our contracts, Ohiolink does full contracts reviewed with an intellectual property lawyer. So we have him contracted, who is in touch with Ohio State University's legal department. And as my lawyer and I work through contracts, he will communicate with OSU legal on the process and what is going on and the success, or if he needs any advice from OSU legal on how to handle something, that communication path is open. OSU, because they're our fiscal agent, has to approve all contracts for final signature. So that is an important part there for us. I will do simple amendments in-house with just OSU Legal's office guidance because, again, we have a contracted lawyer, and it doesn't make any financial sense for me to send simple amendments that we could easily do in-house and use some of our funds towards those amendments. As a general rule, we try to have separate contracts for separate resources. So I'm talking ebooks and journals. And the simple fact to this is, if I am locally loading journals from a publisher, but I have an ebook package with that publisher, and I might not be locally loading those ebooks, I have a whole different set of terms and conditions that I need to deal with. On one side, dealing with local load and ownership. On the other side, focusing really more on accessing to that point. So it was easier for us to try to keep those contracts separate. I have to admit, I did get some pushback from some vendors when we started going down this path, but eventually they came around and things are working just fine. Okay, for our library-specific contract language references, we use, for the most part, the LibLicense Model License Agreement, and we've also taken a look at CDL, California Digital Library Standard License Agreement, and came up with points that we look at through the process. Okay, so what is our process? We do not have a model license that we ask all of our vendors to start with. We actually work from a vendor's contract and review for our particular items from there. And the next slide, I'll cover the things that we tend to focus on in our contracts. So our steps for getting there are Ohiolink offices makes an initial pass making notes or edits for our lawyer. So I'll get a contract from a lawyer, and at this point I think it's important to note that I always ask for a Word document that is not locked down, and then I make a promise that I will use track changes moving forward, and that's how we go back and forth with any vendor. So I got a lot of pushback from vendors initially, wanting to just send me a PDF of a document, but I was assured by my lawyer to keep insisting on a Word doc. And what that does for you is it saves you time, because as you know, tracking changes in a Word document is much easier than trying to make notes or tracking edits or changes on a PDF document. So I'll take an initial pass and make notes or edits for our lawyer. So I might highlight a section and say, I don't like the way this sounds, what do you think? Or I don't like the way this sounds, can you please try to rework this and make this more mutual? What my lawyer does in his review is take a look, as I mentioned, on our specific topics that we like to focus on our contracts. Again, I'll go over that on the next slide. From there, I take that reviewed contract from my lawyer. I talk it through with him. We make any edits as necessary or comments, and then I zip that off to the vendor, present it to the vendor for consideration. And from here begins the final contract negotiation dance. And as most of you know, that can take 4 days, it can take several months, really just depending on what you're trying to push back on with contract language or what you are trying to get to for final contracts. Okay, so what do we really focus on? Okay, as I mentioned, the things we need to take a close look at on our consortial license are affiliated institutions. So this is quite honestly not very fun, but we have to do it. In all of our contracts, we have a listing of our participating institutions. You would be shocked, well, maybe not, to find that sometimes institutions somehow get dropped in a listing of a contract. Again, I don't think it's malicious. I think it's just the matter of the process. As I mentioned, we have 121 libraries, so making sure that they're all listed appropriately on the contract is of the utmost importance, because if somebody should say, I don't have access, and you need to go say, yes, this person should have access, and they're not listed on the contract, that creates all sorts of issues. We also take a close look at the definition of authorized user. We also look at the method of access. We take a look at privacy and confidentiality. And this is something that we've been really focusing on over the last year or so. It's the handling of PII information. We have a whole separate section that we've been trying to put in our contracts dealing with PII. We take a look at authorized uses, so your traditional ILL, text and data mining, your relationship for this content with your faculty's delivery system for courses, course reserves, scholarly sharing. We have a blurb about proxies and that being allowable. We also cover licensor performance obligations, and this is, I have to say, there's a lot of back and forth on here. So it's availability, quality of service, notice of modifications, if they're ADA compliant or not. So this is really your uptime, 99% uptime, those types of things. This next one is huge for us as a consortium, which is usable usage statistics. So making sure that it's counter compliant. So for us as a consortia, a lot of times vendors aren't producing or giving us usage statistics in aggregate. So we may have to go out to a usage platform and run a usage report per member institution, so then we can pull those together for an aggregate Ohiolink use scenario, which is very time consuming and complicated. So we are trying to get vendors towards making sure they're providing us aggregate use as well as use in which we can parse it out and do appropriate analysis. For us in Ohio, we can't agree to indemnification, so that's something that I've gone over time and time again with some vendors. We have a multi-year state funding clause, and this is something that might be interesting for some of you, because as I mentioned, we get capital dollars for some of our resources. We have a clause in there that should we not receive capital dollars at any point, and we've signed a multi-year contract, that we can exit the contract without there being any issue with the vendor. I have to include content that deals with locally loaded resources, so language focused around the ownership. I also, asking them, covering, making sure we have the rights to that content, but on the flip side, I need to also assure them that we're being responsible with their data. So we will put information in there about our security levels and how we are working with that data to ensure that they're okay with the process. I also zoom right into post-cancellation terms, as I'm sure all of you do. And then again, most recently, we've been trying to deal with what's going to happen to us with GDPR. So making sure that we are putting the right data protection language in our contracts so we are covered under GDPR. I'm not going to go into this much more here, so I would like to point out that if you haven't gone through the series presentations, you really should. It is amazing. They did wonderful jobs, and specifically, if you're looking for the fundamentals of licensing, Lori Dugan's presentation, the very first, was spot on, and everything that Lori talked about are things that I have gone through in a contract. Then again, with Tom Lipinski's legal issues in licensing, everything that Tom mentioned in that session, I have tried to work through with a vendor. Okay. So communicating contract terms with members. As I mentioned, I have my CERM representatives, and they function as the core group to try to get the word out. So with CERM representatives, a lot of times if I get questions from membership, from staff at a particular member, and it's not the CERM representative, I will try to drive them to their CERM representative to ask questions about what is going on, because that is how it should work. They should hear how the deal was constructed through their representative's eyes. We do general announcements and weekly Ohiolink email blasts. And then most recently, our collections analyst has her own listserv of electronic resource librarians. We call it the Electronic Resource Implementation Team. And this is a listserv for which we make sure that all of our members has one member on this listserv. And this is the one person that is supposed to communicate content changes to the rest of their organization. And this has been really successful. We've implemented this maybe about 6 or 7 months. Joanna's my collections analyst, she'll do announcements to the group about content, if we have any platforms that are getting upgraded, anything that's changing. That is a great outlet for us to get that information out to the membership. There is a resource information section on the Ohiolink extranet, which our members can look at minutes from the CERN meetings and take a look at in-depth deal and contract information. And I'm going to show you a screenshot of that in a second. And then something that I'm very excited about that's forthcoming is our Ohiolink Members portal, in which our members will be able to go in and take a look at what has been on the contract, what they have purchased, the amount that they have put towards of their local dollars towards a deal, and so on and so forth. Okay, so a quick screenshot here of our resource information page. This is, again, singing the praises of the collections analyst here, Joanna, really trying to get the information out there for which we knew we were getting a lot of questions. So you can see, we'll give the status of a package, the term that it's sitting on, the number of users, because again, if you're thinking about databases, it might not be unlimited users. There's a link here to look at the terms and use from the licensees. And there you can see, our members can see the actual definition of an authorized user, and then something else that they look at a lot is ILL rights and printing rights for a particular publisher, so they can access all of that. There's a few other informational pieces on here, some notes, and then at the very, very bottom, you'll see the current title lists, and this is huge too, because a lot of times we'll get questions from members asking, do we have this or don't we have this? And this gives them an opportunity to take a look at the licensed title list themselves and make that judgment call. Okay, so I have some scenario polls I'd like to go through with all of you, just to kind of get an idea of what is going on here. So the first question has to do, here we go, great. The first question has to do with your institution and acquiring local content. So this is a very simple question. My institution also acquires additional local content from the same publishers that is not included in consortia deals. So that is a yes or no. So say your consortia has a package with Wiley. It's not everything Wiley has. So your institution are picking up these extra 10 or whatever journal titles. Okay, let's take a look. That's what I thought. Okay, so now I have a follow-up question to that, because, you know, it's what's that communication level like as far as working through that contract, right? So the next question is, if you answered yes, generally, the contracts for these deals are separate, so they don't reference the consortial contract at all. So if you can select yes or no, and this is again generally. Okay, let's take a look. Great. Okay, so this was something I was actually not sure how the community at large was taking care of this, and I wanted to touch upon. In many instances, if I have an institution that is working on a contract with a vendor that we have a contract with, I will work with that institution's legal department to make sure that they have a copy of the contract and everything that they need. And then from there, that institution can decide if they want to modify any of the T's and C's in their local version of the contract or adopt them all in general. Okay, and now I have one more question, and it's something I haven't discussed much here. This is me being very curious, actually. So when you have content acquired through a consortium, and you have reports of excessive downloading, are they reported directly to you at your institution? Are they reported to you via your consortium, or is it a combination of both? So a vendor emails you and says, we've noticed that there's excessive downloading, we want to shut down access, you need to take care of this, this is what is going on. How are those reported to you? Okay, let's take a look. Interesting. Okay. Here at Ohiolink, we are sitting under the both scenario. However, if I had to break it up percentage-wise, 90% of what they call excessive downloadings, or some might define as a breach, comes through Ohiolink. And this is something that we worked very hard on here at Ohiolink, simply because I here at the center need to know what activity is going on that the vendor is deeming not reasonable. And that plays into all sorts of scenarios. You know, when I'm negotiating with a vendor, I want to know, you know, if they're going to come back and tell me that we have, you know, rogue users. So all of that information, if you're not doing this through your consortium or communicating that with your consortium, I would advise that you take a look at that, because that has been eye-opening for us here at Ohiolink for many different levels. Okay, that is the last of my questions. I am right on time here, so we have time for some questions. There we go.
Hi, Amy. Thank you. This has been a really interesting session, and we already have a lot of questions coming in. So we'll get right started. Some of these are from the beginning of your session. When you say that medical schools and law schools or libraries are separate members because of their funding line, is that a general statement, variable across the consortia? Does that seem to be always the case in Ohio?
So for all Ohiolink members, if an institution has a medical school and a law school, we have memorandums of understanding with all of our libraries. So those 3 different libraries will have their own MOUs.
Okay.
Is that helpful?
I think so.
Okay.
Does Ohiolink facilitate any formal decision-making model in the strategy discussion or voting process? And so I think some of these questions are really about how CIRM works and how the larger board works. So some of the things were multi-voting versus majority voting, consensus building. Basically, how do they make decisions?
Right. So there is a voting mechanism for all of the CIRM members, and once we get to I guess the thing is that there really isn't ever a contentious vote, because we are constantly talking about the deal that is on the table and molding it and shaping it together to make sure that we're making sure the majority of our members are happy with the deal. So I have to say there's never been a contentious vote on content because of the process that we're working through up through that vote. As far as voting, CIRM, and this is a policy that we have in place, the LAC committee gives CIRM the authority to vote and renew on deals as long as they're under $1 million. So any deal that we cut or renewal that we cut that's over $1 million, CIRM will vote on and approve, and then Gwen, our executive director, will take that CIRM vote information, pass it on to LAC, the Library Advisory Council, and then they will vote yes or no on that resource simply because of the dollar amount.
And how many members are in CIRM, and who chairs them, and how are the appointments made?
Sure, I knew this was going to come up. So we have in Ohiolink what are called charter members. And again, if you'll remember that we're a state agency and we get state dollars. So any state agency of Ohio, 4 years are considered charter members, and then we have a few exceptions, Case and Dayton. All of those institutions have CERM representation there. We also have 3 representatives for all of the community colleges and 3 representatives for all the independent colleges. And these reps are amazing, and they have their own, you should say, challenges they need to overcome with communicating what happens in CERM, but they do a great job. So those reps communicate with their communities about what is going on with CERM. A lot of times for those verticals, the community colleges and the 4 years, they will do their own vote to decide how they're going to divvy up the 3 representative votes that they have. So for example, the independent colleges have come to me before, and I've set up a survey for them to go out and send to their membership to ask them if they want yes or no, and then based on their response, they will divide up those 3 votes accordingly.
Okay. One question actually referred to the GDPR in Europe. Have you currently experienced problems getting usage data from the European-based vendors?
No. Now I'm intrigued.
Well, I was appreciative that you talked about it at all. And then working with the OSU staff, how do you ensure that they know the contract requirements of all the other public institutions as they change? They used specifically the VPAT and the other accessibility info.
Right. So this is something I maybe could have, this was a good question because I had this in my head to talk about. As CERM is discussing deals, we will also discuss things that are coming up contractually. And OSU is a really good example because Ohio State University is constantly looking at how they're approaching terms and conditions in contracts. So I will hear that from the Ohio State University's CERM rep within our meetings, which is great because then we have a broader conversation with the resource committee. But those are also conveyed to me through the Ohio State University legal office. So I want to be clear here. I am not running my contracts through the library at the Ohio State University. I am directly working with legal affairs at the Ohio State University.
Okay. Do you use interlibrary loan data when analyzing subscription ebooks outside of the package?
We do not. However, we have taken a look at ILL usage for canceled packages. As I mentioned, when we cancel something, we take that very seriously, and we want to see what is going on. So we haven't, that is actually a very good idea.
And do members have access or copies to all the negotiated license agreements?
They will as soon as we get the member portal up and running. So right now we have the member portal up and running for internal. So Ohiolink Central Office is at access, and we're working on making sure we have the appropriate access levels set up for our members to then go in. On that, if you take a look at my second last slide, on this section, on the extranet, the Ohiolink extranet, they can, on that view, terms of use from licensee, we have those parsed out. So you can easily, user can easily jump in and say, okay, what are the ILL, what's the ILL language for this particular vendor? Or what is the ADA language for this particular vendor? Acceptable use, et cetera, et cetera.
And it looks like we have time for one more question. Do you have any open access deals under the consortium?
No.
Okay. Maybe one more question. How do you monitor license compliance?
So that, thankfully, I have to admit, I have a lawyer who's an IT specialist who is very good, and he and I continually take a look at contracts. He stays up to date on the laws, and he has come to me at several points and said, hey, this has come up. We should talk about how we want to try to address this in any of our contracts moving forward, and we have a conversation from there. And again, because we're Ohio State University, my lawyer's name is Greg. Greg will loop in Ohio State University to see if there's anything going on campus there as far as T's and C's are concerned, and we can marry anything that we'd like to put in a contract.
Great. We thank you. We do have a few remaining questions that were submitted, and Amy has agreed to help answer them in writing, and we'll send them out when we send out the slides and the recordings. We're glad you could be here with us today. You will soon receive a short online evaluation form. Please take a few minutes to respond to the questions. Your comments are very valuable, and they help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slides and recording, and you now have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be in the email. I want to thank our presenter, Amy Pawlowski, and thank you also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Joseph Nicholson and Wanda Jazayeri, and to Alana Warren from the ALCTS office. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars. ALCTS has other continuing education opportunities coming up. We have several more webinars this fall, including a two-part series on special collections cataloging and a two-part series on data visualization. See the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these events. ALCTS also offers web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, as well as 2-day email discussions. Our next e-forum will be on October 16th on outward-facing technical services. Check the website for information on upcoming courses and discussions. Thank you all for joining us today, and this concludes our session.